welcome. So I want to welcome Daniel Joseph Polikoff, and Ashton will be presenting him today.
Thank you guys for coming out tonight. So Daniel Joseph Polikoff has a PhD of comparative literature from Cornell. He's a poet, translator, and internationally known Rilke scholar. He has guest taught at Sonoma State University and the PCC program here, and is currently an adjunct professor in the Jungian Psychology and Archetypal Studies program at Pacifica Graduate Institute. In addition to his book on Rilke and archetypal psychology, In the Image of Orpheus, Rilke, A Soul History, he has published 2 books of poetry, a translation of Rilke's sonnets to Orpheus, and a creative nonfiction work chronicling his linked relationships with Rilke and the anti-death penalty work through Rilke. He lives with his family north of San Francisco, and today he'll be presenting about Anthony Damiani's work, Astronoesis, which presents a philosophical foundation, like a metaphysical foundation for astrology, rooted in ancient wisdom principles in the West.
Thank you. Thank you. So is this doing anything?
No, it's not.
So I can kind of
just push it under there.
put it under the. Well, I'm very pleased to be here tonight. This evening has been long in the coming. I've wanted to try and introduce Anthony's work for some years now, and I've never quite managed to do so because it's a vast endeavor. So we'll see how it goes tonight. Before introducing the very complex and fascinating and deep work, I want to give you some idea of who Anthony was as a person. Anthony, and I studied with Anthony for, was his student for a very short time before his death in 1984. So I have a personal connection with him. Anthony Damiani was an Italian-American born in 1922. He grew up in Brooklyn. He was not a star student in school. In fact, he was learning difference. And the story is that when he was with those other slow kids, he snuck off to read Plato. And from the first, he was very much a self-taught philosopher. He never graduated college. He married his childhood sweetheart and had 6 sons, and worked as a longshoreman, and also in an isolated part of the New York subway system so that he could read philosophy and religion at night when no one was really coming through to bother him. So a unique and really truly American personality. He moved to the Finger Lakes area in the 60s, where he opened after a attack. He felt that he could no longer keep his studies to himself, but wanted to share them. And he opened a bookstore in Ithaca called the American Brahmin Bookstore. And students from Ithaca, some from Cornell, started hanging around the bookstore and realized that there was a philosopher in their midst, and he was teaching philosophy and meditation. And these students ultimately joined forces to open a Center for Philosophical Research outside of Ithaca in Valois, which was called Wisdom's Goldenrod Center for Philosophical Research, which they built in the early 70s. And I think it was the early 70s. And this was quite a remarkable place. It's still there. Anthony's library was tremendous, and there were classes there on meditation, astrology, and world religion and philosophy. I came in contact with Wisdom's Goldenrod while I was a graduate student in comparative literature at Cornell, and just at the tail end of Anthony's life before his death in 1984. And to give you a bit of a living picture of him, I want to read a little bit of his son, Paul Damiani's tribute to Anthony upon his death, and it's called An American Philosopher. His love for wisdom and meaning in all its historical diversity may only be compared to his love of humanity and its higher potentials. It was an occasion to find a thinker or philosopher with whom he wasn't acquainted. For philosophy to him meant comparative philosophy, involving dialogue, debate, discussion, and exchange of ideas. If he demonstrated a preference, it was for the spirit of Greek philosophy, where the spirit and principles of democracy itself were born some 2,500 years ago. He is an American philosopher in the tradition of Ralph Waldo Emerson, wherein he placed upon himself the demand to acknowledge and investigate the human being's striving for a nobler life as bodied forth in its diverse cultures, religions, and philosophies. He studied under Christian Jesuits, Hindu pundits, Zen Buddhists, and New York professors. By the way, in the last years of his life, he was a close personal friend of the Dalai Lama's as well, and vice versa. Yet like Emerson, he had to go his own way in the face of opposition from all quarters, friends, foes, families, and students. For all his erudition, he was no scholar or academician, but more like an artist, inspiring those around him to explore the mysteries of the universe, soul, and God, always egging one on and snaring one into thinking. And in the act of thinking, he would point to those diviner implications in the human being, the light of his soul, its ordering presence, and the facticity of each person's higher potentials. Philosophy for Anthony was this inalienable aspect of the human being. No school, religion, or group has a monopoly on it, for it flows and follows along the spirit of wonder and inquiry itself. For as he once expressed, philosophy aims to bring about good citizenship with the whole of humankind and the world. Look at a little sketch of Anthony, and Paul's mention of Emerson here is highly relevant, because in fact there's one natal chart in Astronoesis other than Anthony's own, and that's Emerson's. Something of the gist of that connection might be glimpsed in the fact that Emerson and Anthony's own mentor, Paul Brunton. Does people know of Paul Brunton and his work? Yeah. He was one of the very, very first individuals, a British man who went to the East and to Egypt and really brought back meditation, yoga. So one of the pioneers of the actual praxis of Eastern spirituality in the West. Anyway, Paul Brunton employed virtually the same term in designating the spiritual essence of the human being. Brunton's over-self and Emerson's oversoul are one and the same idea. And both Brunton, who Anthony and all of us used to call PB, that's what he went by for Paul Brunton, and both PB and Emerson, like Anthony after them, integrated Eastern and Western spiritual perspectives. This is more explicit in Brunton's career, which revolved around his, at the time, path-breaking work. Nor were certain strains of Eastern, especially Vedantic spirituality, unimportant to Emerson, our own American Brahmin. Even so, Emerson worked more deeply out of the Romantic tradition of philosophy and poetry, and that tradition's focus on nature as a source of wisdom, guidance, and divine revelation. Emerson himself, moreover, was no stranger to the Greek philosophical currents that flowed so powerfully into the romantic imagination. A passage in Emerson's essay on the Oversoul resounds with Plotinian echoes. Within the human being is the soul of the whole, the wise silence, the universal beauty to which each and every part and particle is equally related, the eternal one. Nature and the soul, and that means two, cosmos and psyche, and the way each mirrored the other remained Emerson's chief objects of contemplation after his decisive break from the church. Anthony figures as an heir of Emerson in this respect, and does so too on account of his radical originality, of his vast vision. Emerson opened his little book on nature with these resonant words. Our age is retrospective. It builds the sepulchres of the fathers. It writes biographies, literary biographies, history, criticism. The foregoing generations beheld God and nature face to face, we through their eyes. Why should not we also have a poetry and philosophy of insight and not of tradition, and a religion by revelation to us and not the history of theirs? Embosomed for a season in nature whose floods of life stream around and through us and invite us by the powers they supply to action proportioned to nature. Why should we grope among the dry bones of the past, or put the living generation into masquerade out of its faded wardrobe? The sun shines today also. Let us demand our own works and laws and worship. Emerson himself, in his very first lecture cycle, issued a clarion call for a doctrine of the soul that would fulfill that high mission. But while Emerson, working out of the spirit of prophecy, offered brilliant rough sketches of some of the contours of such a teaching, he never had the metaphysical acumen to provide a coherent, comprehensive teaching. Anthony did. And his work goes a long way towards fulfilling Emerson's vision of a philosophy of insight and religion of revelation. And as befits any vision coordinating the cosmos and the chambers of the soul, astrology proved central to that vision. And so, Astronoesis, philosophy's empirical context, astrology's transcendental or transcendentalist ground. So what I'm going to try and do here in some way, shape, or form is to introduce you to the substance of Anthony's Astronoesis. And how to do so in a couple of hours is a very daunting challenge. I think it was 2 or 3 years ago that I proposed to Becca to write a 30-page piece on Archetype and the topic. And the article got off to a pretty good start, I think, but when I reached page 100 and still was just laying the groundwork, I knew I was in trouble. So I gave it up and wrote on Wordsworth instead. As I said, that was several years ago, and I'm not entirely sure that I'm more ready to introduce Anthony's vast work even now. And we'll all have to put on our cosmic seatbelts as we do so. But here, for better or worse, I am, and here you are, and I'll do my best to provide what I can in this brief time of a window into Anthony's breathtaking view of the cosmos and of the soul. And I'm going to try and do so in a fashion that makes sure this rocket ship to Mars doesn't leave Psyche behind. So let me begin again by sharing a bit of that unfinished Archetype article. After all, I put a lot of work in it. It begins with 2 quotations. The first from Plotinus, and the second from Anthony. Plotinus. Admiring the world of sense as we look out upon its vastness and beauty, and the order of its eternal march, thinking of the gods within it, seen and hidden, and the celestial spirits and all the life of animal and plant. Let us mount to its archetype, to the yet more authentic sphere. There we are to contemplate all things as members of the intellectual, eternal in their own right, vested with a self-springing consciousness and life, and presiding over all these, the unsoiled intelligence and unapproachable wisdom. Anthony. The astrological mandala provides us with multiple levels of symbolism that will help to make explicit many meanings that are hidden in the Neoplatonic tradition as a whole, and more specifically in the Aeneas of Plotinus. The astrological diagram will allow us to juxtapose philosophy and astrology in such a way as to reveal that the sensible universe, with its array of with its starry host, is the primordial living scripture that embodies the wisdom of primal principles, principles that are as far beyond it as the heavens are beyond the earth, and that the basis of astrology is an acquaintance with the wisdom knowledge that sustains the cosmos. And I'm going to read the first page or so of my article. As it introduces some of the critical themes that I'll be talking about. One is the relationship between philosophy and archetypal cosmology, or in-depth psychology. Archetypal cosmology, as the etymology of the name indicates, owes an inherent debt to the Greek philosophic tradition, especially its Platonic and Neoplatonic currents. Yet while recognizing the pressing need to articulate the metaphysical ground of its hermeneutic endeavors, archetypal cosmology has so far done so only partially, and moreover, after fashions of thought that do not transparently mirror either the technical vocabulary or systematic development of Platonic or Neoplatonic philosophy. No doubt such reticence devolves from two factors: the immense complexity and difficulty of Plato and Plotinus, and, more essentially perhaps, biases inherent in Plato and Plotinus that can make the pure form of their thought inhospitable to, and even repressive of, material and psychological dimensions of human reality. For the lower registers of the soul can hardly be regarded as inferior by practitioners so deeply influenced by the likes of C.G. Jung and James Hillman, for whom it would almost be fair to say that image is all, a proposition utterly irreconcilable with the Platonic worldview, and indeed brazenly standing it on its metaphysical head. As the twin citations heading this article indicate, however, not all thinkers interested in astrological reflection of the human soul's cosmic connections have shied away from the purer strains of Platonic or Neoplatonic philosophy. Indeed, the late Anthony Damiani dedicated much of his remarkable intellectual life to exploring how the framework of Plotinian philosophy may be interpreted and developed so as to provide a comprehensive understanding of the philosophic foundations of astrology. This implies not only or primarily metaphysical cosmological elaboration of how and why astrology works, but more essentially, how the symbolism of the astrological mandala, when articulated and interpreted in conjunction with the wisdom knowledge inherent in Neoplatonic philosophy, may be understood to embody a profound spiritual teaching, to delineate a comprehensive doctrine of soul that outlines a path of self-realization, actualization of that knowledge of who and what one is, human being, that has always been the aim of true philosophy. So that's an introduction, and I'm going to beg your patience to read a bit of the next section as well. And I know it's difficult to hear material read in any case, and perhaps especially so when the material is as metaphysically dense as the next section that I'm going to read. But I'm going to do so because what this section does is introduce the foundation of Plotinus and all of Anthony's work, which that is the principles of the one, the nous, the soul, and nature. And I did not trust myself standing on my feet to give a succinct, concise description of these foundational principles. In fact, Astronoesis has 4 chapters, one dedicated to each of those principles, the one, nous, soul, and nature. So while you're struggling to listen to this material, and I hope I do a good job in presenting these principles, you can take comfort in the fact that you're getting a head start on Astronoesis itself, as you really can't get very far unless one confronts these basic ideas informing all of Plotinus's thought. So here we go, and this will take maybe 20 minutes. And then we'll go from there and try and relate it to depth psychology and a more embodied level of being, and then try and tie them together. To get a feeling for the Neoplatonic understanding, and this is from Astronoesis, a quotation. To get a feeling for the Neoplatonic understanding of ideas, it's important to enter sympathetically into a worldview which in many ways inverts contemporary materialistic views. Neoplatonism views the world, or the cosmos, including individuals, space, time, and matter, as a living idea, a thought within a universal intelligence. Intelligence, in this view, is not a secretion or byproduct of matter. Cosmos and experience are within mind, and for that reason are meaningful. For Plotinus, ideas are real and powerful, infinitely beyond mere concepts. I should make a note that Astronoesis was put out in 2000, which was 16 years after Anthony's death. And much of the book actually was compiled, not by any means all of it, but a good bit of the writing in it is by editors, his students, because he died before the work was complete. He was always much more comfortable as the oral teacher than the writer. And I'd just like the opportunity, take the opportunity to thank the students of Wisdom's Goldenrod for the monumental work of actually bringing this book out and making Anthony's work available in this very beautiful way. And here we go with Plotinus. Rather like its supreme principle, the one, Plotinus's philosophy is at once infinitely complex and profoundly simple. All follows in harmonious order upon that first, the nature and structure of the all elaborated according to a self-consistent logic ruled by a few fundamental tenets. That logically is decidedly not one that subordinates mind to matter, the power of intellection to the behavior of material things. In Plotinus, as in Plato, the intelligible world precedes and transcends the world of sense, even as the latter mirrors the former. The manner and form of that imaging remains central to the inquiry here, which, in accordance with Neoplatonic premises, must nonetheless take the invisible realm of mind itself as its point of departure. Platonian philosophy identifies three primal principles, or hypostases, self-subsistent realities ontologically prior to the system of nature and its associated world of sense. Any understanding of Plotinus accordingly must begin by endeavoring to comprehend something of the nature of these three primals: the one, the nous, which is also called the intellectual principle or the divine mind, and soul. While these terms and their corresponding metaphysical elaboration may initially seem abstract and far removed from the realm of familiar human experience, such need and indeed should not remain the case. But in Plotinus's view, the one, nous, and soul are, on the one hand, divinely numinous principles of infinite scope and power, prone to dwarf the puny conceptions we form of them, and on the other, the present ground of any and all genuine human experience, and indeed precisely that within experience itself that lends it authenticity. And so, to employ a colloquial term, a phrase, makes it real. Let's endeavor then to form a preliminary idea of Plotinus's three primals. Plotinus. The one is all things, and no one of them. The source of all things is not all things, but a universe from an unbroken unity in which there appears no diversity, not even duality. It's precisely because there is nothing within the one that all things are from it. The first and highest hypostasis, the originative and ultimate term of his philosophy, Plotinus calls the one, the Plotinian equivalent of the Platonic good. As its name implies, the one itself is unitary, and indeed the source of all levels of existence. Yet while perfectly simple in and of itself, the one also possesses infinitely abundant power, so that the full multiplicity of all possible authentic existence inheres in it, but not yet as diverse forms of being, for the one is super-essential and transcends being, but in a manner that does not in the least divide or part its unity. Beyond any and all forms of predication, the one thus exceeds the logical distinction between the one and the many, and any other such logical distinctions, including that between transcendence and immanence. For while transcending any particular delimitation of its nature, the one remains the ultimate ground of, and so is omnipresent in or to, all authentic existence. Neither can the putative opposition between fullness and emptiness hold good when speaking of the one, a fact peculiarly illuminated by an interesting sidebar in the life of our chief Plotinus guide. During the years of his work on Astronoesis, Anthony Damiani lived in the proximity of a thriving Tibetan Buddhist community and took part in many philosophical debates with members of that community. In the course of these debates, Anthony often emphasized that the Plotinian one, while void of any determinate content, and so kin to the primordial nothingness underlying Buddhist philosophy, should be considered an essentially positive rather than negative principle. That although it shares much in common with the principle of emptiness grounding much Eastern philosophy, Plotinus chose to designate it the one rather than the zero for good reasons. That reason may perhaps emerge more clearly in connection with the nature of Plotinus' second hypostasis. You were making progress. Subsequent to and flowing from the first. And here's Plotinus. It's precisely because there is nothing within the one that all things are from it. In order that being may be brought about, the source must be no being, but being's generator. seeking nothing, possessing nothing, lacking nothing. The one is perfect, and in our metaphor has overflowed, and its exuberance has produced the new. This product has turned again to its begetter and been filled, and has become its contemplator, and so an intellectual principle. That station towards the one, the fact that something exists in the presence of the one, establishes being. That vision directed upon the one establishes the intellectual principle. Standing toward the one to the end of vision, it is simultaneously intellectual principle and being. And this is the nous, the divine mind. As I just say, we speak here once more of the divine mind, or nous, what McKenna most often translates as intellectual principle. In the Greek, it's just nous, or mind. It is so called because it comes into being by virtue of its act of contemplation of its prior, the one. In that act of contemplative vision, all contained in the one takes on the distinct forms produced by that visioning. The perfectly simplex one gives rise to a divine mind or intelligence that is simultaneously the knower of all possible forms of being, and that being itself the content of its own knowledge act. Yet what kind of being is constituted as the object of pure intellection is of a substance connate to the intellective act. Even in familiar speech, we name the pure content of mind the objective coincident of the activity of thought, idea, as when in the moment our thinking is crowned with momentary success, we say, I have an idea. So the form of being contained within the knowing act of the nous, or intellectual principle, is that of divine idea. The objective content of the divine mind's intellective activity are the Platonic forms or ideas, the original or archetypal ideas that supply the substantive ground of all authentic being and existence, just as the self-reflexive intellective act of nous stands as the ground of not only all possible knowing, but indeed consciousness itself. This harkens back to what I said in an early paragraph, that this metaphysics is pretty elevated and rarefied. At the same time, the claim is that you are conscious, that you can think, that you are aware because you're participating in the nous. That is the ground and origin of the very possibility of consciousness, which means something like with science, with knowing per se. So we'll get later to where we are in relationship to the nous. But it's important to realize that right here, right now, and not just metaphysics. The coincidence of being an idea or ideal form exposes the fundamental discrepancy between Neoplatonic and Buddhistic philosophy referred to earlier. For if the famous Heart Sutra instructs us that form itself is emptiness, emptiness itself is form, the Neoplatonist, while agreeing that, as we'll discuss later, all phenomenal forms of existence are predicated upon a base of non-being called matter, nonetheless holds that the archetypal form of all authentic existence embodies noetic substance, derivative of the divine ideas, and so is ultimately sourced in the authentic being of the divine mind. In Plato and Plotinus, forms not emptiness, but idea, or the imprint thereof. And idea is real being. This truth is, in fact, the ultimate ground of the fundamental value accorded archetypes, or the archetypal, in modern forms of depth psychology, even if its anti-metaphysical practitioners may not recognize it as such. So this is part of the motivation for this whole stream, is that if you're engaged in archetypal studies of any sort, archetypal astrology, archetypal psychology, and you're using that term, the claim is that what it all goes back to is the nous, is the divine mind, the Platonic forms. And we'll, again, later speak about the difference between the depth psychological and Platonic view of the ideas. Yet what of the all-important difference between the intelligible and sensible worlds, ideal form and phenomenal appearance? For in the contemplative vision proper to its own intrinsic being, nous itself remains eternally unmoved, above and beyond the transience permeating material existence. By what mediation might the forms resident in the intelligible sphere enter into manifestation? This question shifts our attention to the principle consequent to the nous in the divine order, Plotinus' third and last hypostasis, soul. The passage previously cited in exploitation of intellectual principle continues on to delineate the origin of soul. Standing towards the one to the end of vision, it is simultaneously intellectual principle and being, and attaining resemblance in virtue of this vision, it repeats the act of the one in pouring forth a vast power. This is the nous. This second outflow is an image or representation of the divine intellect, just as the divine intellect represented its own prior, the one. This active power sprung from essence, from intellectual principle considered as being, is soul. So nous is the emanation of the one, and soul is the emanation of the nous. Soul arises out of the motionless intellectual principle, which itself sprang from its own motionless prior. But the soul's operation is not similarly motionless. Its image is generated from its movement. It takes fullness by looking to its source, but it generates its image by adopting another, a downward movement. This image of soul is sense and nature. So we begin to come then upon the heart of the matter, the vehicle of relation between mind and matter, the intelligible and the sensible worlds. In approaching what Plotinus knows as soul, we verge upon not only the living essence of what we as human beings are, but as well the power responsible for creation of the visible universe, the origin and author of the cosmos. For as Plotinus tells us, soul is a vast power that, flowing forth from the nous on account of the latter's superabundant intelligence, contemplates the ideas constitutive of the divine mind and the authentic being contained therein, and in the form of movement definitive of life itself, manifests that archetypal intelligence as it shapes the living universe, creating all things great and small. Plotinus. Let every soul recall then at the outset the truth that soul is the author of all living things, that it has breathed life into them. Whatever is nourished by earth and sea, all the creatures of the air, the divine stars in the sky, it is the maker of the sun, itself formed and ordered this vast heaven and conducts all that rhythmic motion. And it is a principle distinct from all these, to which it gives law and movement and life, and it must of necessity be more honorable than they, for they gather or dissolve as soul brings them life or abandons them. But soul, since it never can abandon itself, is of eternal being. What does that sound like? It sounds like God, the creator God, right? And in the Plotinian framework, the creative principle that generates the universe is the universal soul. But of course, in Plotinus, That's not the highest principle. You have the nous and the one prior to it. But how and why does soul create the universe? Again, the answer may be found in the form of principles inherent in Plotinus' metaphysical logic. Like its prior, nous, the essence of soul, may be understood as a mode of contemplative vision, at once self-reflexive and generative. But because the soul's contemplative act is less perfect than that of its prior, the self-reflexive and the generative moments of the soul's act don't coincide in the same way they do in the intellectual principle. Soul can't so expertly contain itself within a single station of being. Rather, in its constant endeavor to comprehend all contained within nous, soul, somewhat like an inspired artist, must generate an image reflective of the content of its interior contemplation. That image, that immortal masterwork, is nature in the world of sense, the entire universe. To elaborate, instead of remaining eternally immobile within a single station, soul unfolds its knowledge by recurrent acts of self-succession, producing sequent images of itself that comprise new and different grades of its own soul nature. Although even in the act of differentiation, soul remains continuously unitary, inviolably itself, even while undergoing division. And again, while all this seems very metaphysical, it also, when we talk about psychology, is very immediately applicable to understanding, for example, the relationship between the ego or the self or overself or oversoul. The highest grade of soul thus remains forever stationed in the intellectual, in eternal contemplation of divine ideas. Yet the next and next grade of soul, the gorgeous train of its contemplative elaboration of those ideas, assumes manifest form as the created universe and all diverse grades and kinds of being contained therein. The author and life of that whole, in all its diverse parts, remains soul, Plotinus. The soul's nature and power will be brought out more clearly if we consider next how it envelops the heavenly system and guides all to its purposes. For it has bestowed itself upon all that huge expanse, so that every interval, small and great alike, all has been ensouled. The material body is made up of parts, each holding its own place, but the soul's in no such condition. Each separate life lives by the soul entire, omnipresent in the likeness of the engendering Father, entire in unity, and entire in diffuse variety. By the power of the soul, the manifold and diverse heavenly system is a unit, all the planets. Through soul, this universe is a God, and the sun is a God because it is in soul. So too the stars, and whatsoever we ourselves may be, it is all in virtue of soul, for dead is viler than dumb. So we're almost getting there. Thus, the entire fabric of the universe figures as the shining vestment of soul. The multidimensional structure of the cosmos arises as the objective correlative of the soul's enduring contemplation. In its perpetually creative act, soul itself remains one insofar as all of its phases are continuous with its original nature. It is also, however, many, manifesting diverse levels and kinds of being. The starry host that crowns the universe, our sun and the heavenly system, the earth, the moon, all terrestrial life, even our very human selves. Since the soul fabricates the cosmos on the basis of its contemplation of the ideas in divine mind, the various grades of being constitutive of the cosmic order represent both distinct levels of those archetypal ideas and coincidentally distinct modes of knowing in the soul, its diverse Gnostic functions or faculties. As indicated earlier, distinguishing between and comprehending the essential nature of these levels may prove central to the goal of elaborating the metaphysical ground of astrology, for it's precisely such an understanding that unfolds the all-important relationship between the intelligible and sensible worlds, archetypal ideas and powers on the one hand, and the facts of human experience on the other. The logic of that relation, the dynamic ratio between divine ideas and human sense, comprises the heart of the doctrine of soul inscribed in Damiani's Astronoetic vision. For, in accord with Neoplatonic premises, Damiani understands the human soul's participation in the world of ideas as the path towards true wisdom or spiritual realization. It is so because it is by virtue of such participation that the individual human soul may achieve consciousness of what and who she in truth is, a particular embodiment of the universal forms of divine intelligence, and so a vessel of God. All right. Well, thank you for listening to that. So before we go on and try and hopefully reap a little bit of the harvest, I do feel that it's important to try and go to that most fundamental level of thinking, because that's where Anthony is coming from. And it gives a different place from which to focus then in on particulars in astrology. But before I go further and try and bring some of these ideas more down to earth, does anyone have any pressing question that emerged out of that rather rarefied, but I hope not unclear presentation? If not, I will merely go on with it. Good. I'm hoping we'll have time, that I will be able to leave time for questions, significant number of questions at the end if they come up. Okay, so that's just the beginning of a foundation for understanding the most essential metaphysical principles underlying Astronoesis. I'm not, however, going to read you any more of that unfinished paper. I'm going to have to find some other means of catapulting us ahead to more familiar, though perhaps less stable ground. So to progress from these metaphysical foundations to a cosmological understanding that can more immediately inform our understanding of astrology, we can look at the reflection of Plotinus's hypostases, as such are contained in the form of a kind of a copy or image, here in the system of nature, the cosmos itself. So all these principles, the one, nous, and so, are reflected in nature, the structure of the cosmos. And for this purpose, I'd like to draw upon another esoteric source, the Corpus Hermeticum, the 11th chapter of which, entitled Nous to Hermes, provides a spectacular and cogent summary of the distinct ontological levels comprising the cosmos. And a relevant passage. Has anybody read any of the Corpus Hermeticum? Yeah, it's quite an astonishing work that blends Egyptian mystery wisdom and biblical knowledge with Greek philosophy. So it's a very interesting work. So here we go. Mind, or nous, to Hermes. Since people have said many contradictory things of all sorts about the universe and God, I have not learned the truth. This is Hermes speaking. Make the truth plain to me, Master. The Master is nous itself. It is you alone on whom I may depend to reveal it. Mark my words then, Hermes Trismegistus. and remember what I say. Not every day you get a chance to hear the divine mind speaking, so pay attention. Remember what I say. I will not hesitate to speak what occurs to me. Hear how it is with God and the universe, my child. God, eternity, cosmos, time, becoming. God makes eternity, eternity makes the cosmos makes time, time makes becoming. The essence, so to speak, of God is the good or the beautiful. The essence of eternity is identity, of the cosmos, order, of time, change, of becoming, life, and death. But the energy of God is mind, nous, and soul. The energy of eternity is permanence and immortality. The energy of the cosmos is recurrence and counter-recurrence, of time, increase and decrease, of becoming, quality and quantity. Eternity, therefore, is in God, the cosmos in eternity, time in the cosmos, and becoming in time. Well, that's a mouthful. So this is heady stuff, but no more so than Plotinus or many other esoteric sources. I've made a kind of map or chart of these levels, which you'll see here: eternity, cosmos, time, becoming. And to kind of try and concretize what Hermes is speaking of, I've added correlations from Anthony's own work, because each of the degrees of being or soul consciousness Hermes speaks of can be seen more or less along the lines of Plato's divided line as levels of the sun or cosmic soul's intelligence, the invisible metaphysical ground of our own solar system. So this would be the sun as a star, the starry sphere itself, with eternity. And then the sun as a logos, or reason, contained within itself as the mind of the sensible universe. This is also, again, another fourfold of unity, mind, soul, and nature or body. These fourfolds appear all over the philosophic terrain. So this is the sun as the solar logos, and as we'll see, we'll associate it with Uranus, Neptune, and Pluto. And then at this level of the soul level of time, you'll remember that Plato talks about the planetary spheres as time. This is indeed the sensible sun and the planetary, the sun as a planetary center, and all the powers of the sun. And then in the fourth place, the body place, we have the Earth itself as the body of the solar system. So again, unity, mind, soul, and body. The sun as star, this interesting, difficult place of the solar logos. Both of these, which in terms of the divided line are in the still in the intelligible world. And then the sensible sun, with all its planetary powers as the generative soul principle, and then earth existence, the embodied universe, the becoming in, we don't get in space and time in the sense, in space and time until we get into the realm of becoming, which is birth and death. And you can also think on another scale cosmologically as Uranus, Neptune, and Pluto ruling these great domains of the cosmos. And they are kind of spread out in distinct levels here. But actually, you know, they overlap, and as Plotinus indicated, it's actually all one thing. This distinction here but there's no division. They're all phases of soul consciousness. And that's the key. There's actually no spatial separation, although there is distinction of level, which is native to the nature of soul. So to bring these still more down to earth, we can recognize that it's the fifth, again, the fourth principle is always a copy or a nomen. Are people familiar with the concept of a nomen? It's like it's a copy that contains everything that preceded it. So just as nature kind of contains soul, nous, and one in itself, here the earth itself contains in image form a reflection of all the prior grades of soul consciousness. And this is, of course, the same earth which with our own soul is united. And that, for Anthony, gives his license to identify the correspondent levels of the earth existence and of the human being there with what he calls the subtle bodies. And these subtle bodies, which Anthony draws upon Neoplatonic vocabulary, he calls them the Obvietes, the Neuron body, the sun-like body, and the moon-like and Shelley body, which go together. Those are actually correlated with, well, the Obvietes is what Emerson would call the oversoul or PV, the overself. It would, in terms of a chart, be the unity, which you find nowhere in the chart, but is the transcendent unity, which ties it all back to the very first principle. And you don't have any chart, you don't have any person, you don't have anything until that first one in terms of Platonicist philosophy. And then at the level of neuron, or what Anthony will talk about is reason, with a capital R, that's the transiting Uranus, Neptune, and Pluto, and the sun-like body, and this level here reflects this level. And the neuron reflects this level. It's contained in this one. And the sun-like body reflects the planetary spheres, the sensible sun is planetary center. And then, of course, we only get down to actual embodied individual with the natal chart and the earth. And so, the secret of Plotinus's philosophy of soul is that there's all these nests. Everything is always hierarchicalized, but it's all nested holographically. So you have to make all these distinctions to understand the universe. But then you also have to be able to think in a way that you realize you're not talking about the material universe. So all these things are all in the same place at the same time. And there's really no hierarchy, even though it looks like there is. And if we go back for a moment to think about the essence of soul, which is nested in the intellectual principle, the lowest and the highest are not separated at all. So we're starting to get somewhere. At least can smell a natal chart here. And the question is, where are we in this picture? Well, that depends on how one understands who and what we as human beings or human souls truly are. But we can give kind of two answers to that question. And I've just alluded to the first one. The first answer is that the full extent of our soul, we're this whole thing. Emerson has a passage where he talks about how the human being is the universal man or human. Anthropos is cosmos. So at some level, our being, we are the star, the logos, all the planetary spheres, as well as an embodied being. From an empirical standpoint, of course, we don't always experience ourselves that way. So from an empirical sense, where are we? We're all the way down here, okay? We're right there. We're identified with what Anthony calls the moon-like and the Shelley bodies, which is kind of fancy words for the psyche and the body, the psychosomatic character of our being. That's our embodied self, our own, the empirical human person that experiences itself, not as a piece of the cosmos as a whole, but as a delimited human subject facing what is perceived as other than itself, an objective world. So Anthony writes of this level of being, the imaginal realm of the Earth's dragonic belt, and I'll explain that in a minute, constitutes the moon-like and Shelley bodies, the lowest vehicle of the soul's experience. And then there's this moment where Anthony, so to speak, tries to put Carl Jung in his place. He continues, the functioning of this psychosomatic organism may be referred to as imitative being. Here, and only here, may we speak of Jung's archetypes as the precondition for an individual psychological experience, and say that philosophy is but a mouthing of these archetypes. So from Anthony's perspective, the psychological archetypes are down with the moon and Shelley bodies. And this shouldn't be taken as a dismissal of Jung. In fact, this lowest sheath is as important as any other, and indeed the repository and vessel of all soul. But it is still clearly a moment when Anthony's defending the value of philosophy against the anti-metaphysical strains of a psychology that doesn't believe it's possible for the human mind to access transcendental registers of being and so know any intelligible truth or know anything other than the images generated by its own psychosomatic activity, which is kind of Jung's neo-Kantian stance. Jung is not a metaphysician and he's not a Platonist. And some of the things he said about Hegel, for instance, were quite remarkable. How scathing and dismissive he could be of the very idea of someone trying to arrive at an objective truth. But the value of metaphysical cosmology is that it does give the soul an immensely magnified and expanded vision of its own innermost nature and its true spiritual estate. More than that, Anthony's contention is that the soul can't even really begin to know its given sensible world without reference to the invisible powers and intelligence, the grades of soul and of mind that actually engender that world. And here's a quotation from Anthony. A simplified picture, and that's Anthony's way of talking about a chart like this. This is a simplified picture of the vast cosmological presuppositions must be delineated in order for us to be able to understand our sensible experience. It's approximately in this way, and he was talking about these different sheaths and what they represent, this whole chart. It's approximately in this way that the ancients conceived what conditions were necessary for the arisal of knowledge. The entire panorama of the sensible world, which was fabricated by the gods, was a necessary prerequisite, the stage upon which the actors made their entrances and exits. So the whole point of philosophy is that if you begin with your empirical self, your embodied soul, Well, if you embark upon a quest for the ultimate foundation of your identity, yourself or your I am, your embodied self will ultimately, in stages, reveal itself to be nothing other than an image, in a positive sense, of a much larger consciousness, a reflection of the entire soul, an oversoul that is in reality coextensive with the cosmos. And it's in large part in contemplating that cosmos, nature, in the role of the expositor of the divine mind, which is an Emersonian phrase, that we can come to know that larger awareness in which we always, albeit usually unconsciously, participate. So that's in Emerson's little book on nature, he talks about, well, how do we know the full extent of our being? Because if we just look subjectively, we don't get that far. We need to look at the whole, at nature, the stars, the sun, the whole picture. That said, historically, we do need to recognize that there's a potentially critical point of difference between psychological and philosophical approaches to the self as soul, or the soul as self. Because the Platonic philosopher like Anthony or even Emerson takes a transcendental point of departure for inquiries into the human soul, while depth psychology tends to begin and sometimes end with the psychosomatic, the moon-like or Shelley-like bodies, the embodied soul. This difference, just as it applies to an understanding of the origin of archetypes as such, applies as well to the very idea of soul informing these two traditions. And please be aware that I am not diminishing depth psychology here, because each one has what the other one needs, is my ultimate point. That difference is highlighted by the very first sentence of Plotinus's very first Aeneid, titled The Animate and the Man. So this is the beginning, the very first sentence of the whole Aeneid. And it begins, pleasure and distress, fear and courage, desire and aversion, where have these affections and experiences their seat? Well, to us, that's pretty obvious. To us, it's evident that what Plotinus is talking about is our name for the embodied soul. It's Psyche. It's the Psyche that's the seat of pleasure, distress, desire, etc. Well and good. But we need to recognize that that's not the case for Plotinus. For him, soul proper, the essence of soul, abides in all that remains transcendent, above and beyond this order of human experience. And of course, Plotinus is not unique in this. This is Plato, this is the strand of all otherworldly religion and philosophy. And here's Plotinus. How could the soul lend itself to any admixture? An essential is not mixed, or to the intrusion of anything alien. If it did, it would be seeking the destruction of its own nature. Pain must be equally far from it. And grief, how or for what could it grieve? Whatever possesses existence possesses it unalloyed and is supremely free, dwelling unchangeable within its own peculiar nature. What such an existence is, it is unchangeably. So it's not involved, the soul isn't involved in the realm of becoming for Plotinus, soul proper. And he's associating it with the higher reaches of being. But Anthony's endeavor must be to inquire ultimately into the relationship between that exalted level of soul consciousness, the fount of the oversoul, and our own embodied consciousness, our mortal psyche. And to progress further here and to find out what's kind of at stake at these different constructions of soul, and the relation to one another, we need to understand something of the metaphysical essence of matter that is the basis of the soul's embodiment. This also has everything to do with why there's a gap in consciousness between our empirical embodied consciousness and the spiritual ground of our being. Why we find ourselves on earth often pretty oblivious of the divine ground of our own soul consciousness. What we're talking about here is, mythologically speaking, the fall, the exile of the human soul from Eden, or God consciousness, and its entrance into the world of becoming, which is marked by toil, suffering, and death. Now, what is called matter is the predicate of the soul's incarnation and the forgetfulness that characterizes its existence in this world. And it's crucial to recognize that the Plotinus matter is exactly not substance, but the opposite. And this is very interesting. Matter is the absence of all real being, life, intelligence, or form. Matter is nullity, the absence of consciousness. As such, it functions as the ground of what Anthony calls tropes, and which we can readily recognize as the automatic and iterative channeling of energy associated with samsara, the ineluctable force of habit, which at a far deeper level constitutes karma. The realm of repetitive function is essentially the default of conscious function. It's also what we call the realm of the instincts. And Anthony associates it with what he calls the dragon and with the automatic compulsion of instinctual life. And this isn't a minor force, but a tremendous one. It's the force of nature, and it is by definition unconscious. So the idea is that soul, nous is consciousness, and soul has consciousness, and these are all levels of self-awareness. And you need the principle of matter, which is nothing, which is a principle of negation, to be able to have an ego that is experiences something as other than its own consciousness and experience itself as in space and time, rather than just as part of the seamless whole of spiritual reality. But let's hear for a moment Anthony's description of the nature and origin of this dragon that is associated with that mixture of soul and matter that we call psyche, and Plotinus calls the animate. So again, we're trying to get to, well, how do we understand how we have the empirical consciousness of a subject divided from objects in the first place, when the ground of our being is cosmic in extent. And here's Anthony on that question. If we conceive of the Mother Earth as a goddess within whose domain has transpired the manifestation of innumerable species of life, their immediate origin would be her body itself. This body will contain the necessary ingredients for the building up of the two lowest sheaves, what are referred to in Neoplatonism as the Shelleyan moon-like bodies, the psychosomatic. That's us. This material has been recycled innumerable times. It therefore has certain tendencies or proclivities which are indications of past functioning, and which may be referred to as tropes. The combination of the great elements into organized living bodies includes these selected responses or tendencies that manifest themselves in the body's functioning. And here are retained traces of the entity's functioning after its dissolution, and the totalities of these traces constitutes the memory of the earth. This beginningless ontogenetic and phylogenetic development is the source from which and within which the bodies of all living creatures are produced and live. this indefinite and indeterminate storehouse of images, this seething cauldron of innumerable disembodied functionings is suggestive of the nature of the dragon. The moon-like and shelly bodies of living creatures are an embodiment of it, and their activity is refunded to this subconscious. So those of you who are listening with Jungian ears may recognize that this dragon, this subconscious, is in fact very close to what Jung calls the collective unconscious. It's the collective force of all the traces of prior life and its energy. Okay, so to try and get some kind of review of how we're trying to understand ourselves here, we can say that we've actually laid the groundwork for a threefold understanding of our human being. We have, first of all that Plotinus would rank with essential soul, with that which in and of its own essence isn't involved in the body or the realm of becoming at all. It would be probably more likely to call that spirit, and it is effectively superconscious. Then we have the dragonic instinctual realm of the unconscious, that is the soul in its association with an attachment to the body. And third, we have the soul or psyche itself, a part of which, so to speak, is thus attached to and immersed in the body, and another aspect of which remains continuous with and participant in that higher register, Plotinus's essential soul or spirit. So we're back here to a tripart division of the human being into something we could call spirit, soul, and body, which, as Hillman perceptively recognizes, is absolutely necessary to avoid those stark dualisms that actually violently suppress the reality of the medial term, the soul qua psyche itself or herself. Now, how do these terms relate in the model that Anthony's trying to develop? One that would effectively synthesize philosophical and depth psychological perspectives on the soul. Because the philosophical perspectives tend to emphasize the value of the spirit, and the depth psychological perspectives are invested in the reality of the embodied soul, and they can see things in very different ways. And what's at stake here is trying to see them as part of one picture, based on these wisdom principles with astrology as a vehicle of doing so. So as we heard in the introductory passage about the soul, even apportioned into a phase that remains undivided, the spirit, and one that's divisible among bodies, remains an inviolable unity. It's still one and the same soul. So the soul in the body innately aspires to reunite in consciousness with that higher oversoul from which it descended, and which is ultimately the ground of its true being, its I am. But, and here's where a contemporary depth psychologically informed model differs critically from certain older logocentric forms of thought. This can't entail abandonment of the embodied soul, the psyche, but rather, as in the myth of Psyche and Eros in Jung's psychology, it involves the purificatory transformation or metamorphosis of the psyche, so that this embodied soul metamorphoses into a sacred vessel that can effectively unite with spirit and vice versa. This ultimate integral unity of spirit, soul, and body is the final goal of alchemical process. So it's true that there's no higher or lower, but there is the crucial dynamic by which the psyche, which is bound to certain unconscious and compulsive patterns of thought and behavior by virtue of its incarnation, seeks to liberate itself from the compulsive character of these tropical or instinctual energies, so that the body, the habit body, becomes an instrument rather than antagonist of spiritual consciousness. And that's the path of soul making or individuation. Now, this in itself is pretty traditional and very consistent with Jung's alchemical model of the individuation process. But what Astronoesis contributes is a cosmological background for that process, and very critically, a specification of the different modes or levels of Gnostic and creative function that the soul needs to participate in if it's to assimilate the wisdom of the cosmos and transform so it can know who and what it truly is, so that Psyche and Logos become more and more closely wed, and Psyche becomes more and more the embodiment or conscious manifestation of the spirit. In practical sense, that means growing into who you are and realizing the destiny given to you and your peculiar genius. Now, I'm going to try and get to what Anthony has to offer in terms of seeing astrology differently. And of course, it took me longer than I hoped to get here. But the perspective is that you have the embodied soul, the psyche, which is identified with the body, and to understand the fullness of itself, it has to avail itself of consciousness, first of all, from a more heliocentric position, which would be represented by the world transits that come through what he calls the sun-like body. And Anthony makes a point that the way he understands the planets at the level of the sun-like body is as rational or Gnostic functions. Net rational or Gnostic or creative functions, which are different and complementary to the psychosomatic functions that operate at the level of the moon-like and Shelley body, or the embodied soul. And this is, I'm going to share a passage from Anthony where he speaks about that difference and then try and illustrate it with respect to at least one given planet. So here's Anthony on the planets as rational and instinctual functions. Every individual human soul as related to the earth soul participates in the unembodied rational soul powers, as well as in the embodied functions imaged in the dragon. The rational powers correspond to the soul's virtues or perfections, while their presence in the embodied ego takes the form of archetypal determinators, corresponding to Jung's archetypal functions, and instinctual or unconscious functions. Another way to say this is that the undivided rational mind is creative and Gnostic. The embodied ego functions are transformed by these powers and are available to the individual person in experience. The planets are the presence of the soul powers or functions, and they function at a spectrum of levels. The natal planets in the houses are the physical instinctual functions, and in the signs, the psychic functions. But the planets as transiting are the rational soul powers or virtues. And only as reflected within the individual ego, what Plotinus calls the animate, or we call the psyche, are these powers fragmented. The actualization of these powers is illustrated in astrology, where the rational powers of the soul are represented by the transiting planets, and the embodied powers by the planets in the natal chart. The individual functions represented by the natal positions are both continuous with and distinct from the transiting powers. Thus, there's a spectrum of levels of function for each of these powers, from the instinctual to the rational. And it's important to notice here that Anthony's not talking about cutting off the psychosomatic functions or the instinctual functions or the psychological archetypes. He's talking about a blending of a rational, creative, Gnostic level of function, which would come from the world transits with embodied psychological functioning. And that's a kind of difference from certain more orthodox strains of Platonic philosophy, which would entail, so to speak, an abandonment of the psyche and its embodied nature. But at the same time, Anthony's not so clear about any particular power that might be specifically associated with this cooperation of the rational or sun-centered and the embodied or earth-centered faculties. So as a prelude to looking at least one of his delineations of archetypal powers of the soul in both its rational and psychosomatic functions, we should ask, is there indeed such a power? And if so, what is it? This is a crucial question, and in fact one pivotal to the very attempt to marry philosophy and depth psychology. So the answer to this question should be somewhat evident in the way that I've set up the chart. What is it that links the lowest level of the embodied soul with the rational, creative, Gnostic soul powers of the world transits? It's this locus here, which are associated with the personal transits, and you'll see that the moon is identified with that locus. And here again, we can draw on Hermes for help in understanding that. Look, here's Muse to Hermes. Through me, look out on the cosmos set before your gaze and observe its beauty carefully, a body undefiled, than which nothing is more ancient, always in its prime and young, and yet even more in its prime. And see the seven worlds spread out below, marshaled in eternal order, each completing eternity in a different circuit. See how everything is full of light, yet nowhere is there fire. The attracting and combining among things contrary and unlike became light shining down from the energy of the God, who's Father of all good, ruler and commander of the whole order of the seven worlds. Here's the point. Coursing ahead of them all is the moon, nature's instrument, transforming the matter below, and in the midst of the universe is the earth, the nurse who feeds terrestrial creatures, settled in the beautiful cosmos like sediment. Look at the multitude, how great it is, of immortal living beings and of the mortal, and in between the two, the mortal and the immortal, the circling moon. So again, this isn't the moon in the natal chart per se, although it's related to that, but it's the moon as anima mundi, the world soul, where we could talk about the sun as the world mind, bringing in the intelligence of the cosmos as a whole, but the archetypal intelligence of the sun being mediated, related to our embodied psychology, our psychosomatic
nature through the cosmic moon. And both of these levels working in combination, I think of as what Coleridge talks about as the primary and the secondary imagination. And so taken conjointly, they would represent the creative imagination, which mediates sense experience of an empirical self and its world, with all the higher spiritual intelligence coming through the Transcendental. Well, I can at this point, I mean, we have about 20 minutes left. And I can at this point give an example of, well, I do want to say that, to fill that out, and I want to leave time for questions, that Anthony, how does Anthony describe the moon, for instance, as a rational function? And how would that be different from the way we might usually speak about it? So the moon has a rational soul power. Here's Anthony. As a rational soul power of recollection or reminiscence, the Platonic anamnesis, the moon recalls the soul to its true place in the divine mind. Through the power of memory, the rational soul assimilates its experience and provides a continuity through the discontinuous or moment-to-moment manifestation of the world. Memory at the rational level is primarily a power and not mere passivity, and memory is even impeded by the body. And then he goes on to say that through its cyclic nature, the moon also acts as a vehicle of memory, perception, and sensation, and emotion at the level of our embodied nature. And it's this combination of the embodied function of the moon as memory, which sews together ourselves as a personal identity, with the fact that the moon acts as this vehicle of reminiscence, Platonic anamnesis, because the moon is in the course of our lives. The moon, when it operates in this creative Gnostic way, is remembering the creative idea of ourselves that's symbolized by the sun. And as I say, these two cooperate to give us an act of creative imagination by which our psyche, our embodied selves, seek to remember, to recollect the whole spiritual nature of our being, and effectively to reconcile ego and oversoul, to go back to Emerson. Well, we're running short, and I had planned to talk about Wordsworth as an example of an individual in whose life you can see how the psychological dimensions of the moon in his functions of memory and emotion. He defined poetry as emotions recollected in tranquility. And you know that there's a very immediate sense of emotional presence in poems like the Tintern Abbey. And of course, Wordsworth writes the first epic of individuation in the Prelude, which poem itself is a kind of epic expansion of the very personal recollections that he shares in a poem like Tintern Abbey. At the same time that there's this level of personal experience, relationship to the sister, very embodied psychology, he is, in the course of that poem, relating to the wisdom of nature, the wisdom of the cosmos, which is guiding his striving to understand the soul and to understand himself. And that's the theme of the prelude. And in general, Romanticism, I think, can be looked upon as inaugurating a way that the individual mind embodied in its personal circumstances. And that embodiment is, again, and I talk about this in the article, which I hope you'll all read when it comes out in Archive. The poems like Tintern and Coleridge's Frost at Midnight, which are called conversation poems, are often identified by the fact that they identify themselves in terms of date, place, and time. Lines written in Tintern, blah, blah, blah. That's characteristic of these poems. You have this very specific grounding of human experience in given physical and emotional situations. At the same time, the process of recollection, of memory, often in terms of the beauty of nature, reveals a kind of deeper process of reminiscence that is a way of accessing guidance from the cosmos and from the deeper or higher soul that's embedded in that cosmos. And why don't we, so that's kind of a key point here, that what I see is that the reconciliation between a depth psychology, which rightfully is focused on the embodied soul, our embodied experience as empirical human beings. But we know that that personal level never feels sufficient, that the soul is always trying to know more of itself, that we're not satisfied in just our empirical or purely personal relationships. We're looking for some transpersonal, transcendental level of who we are in existence, which is so wonderfully spoken about by transcendentalists like Emerson or philosophers like Anthony. And you have the whole glorious vision of the spiritual registers of the soul that will come through what Anthony calls spiritual knowing, feeling, and willing. All of Astronoesis is coming out of an act of spiritual knowing. You're talking about truth that's really detached from a particular experience. And that's very powerful. But in order for that to be integrated into human experience, which is what astrology wants to help us with, you have to go through this medium of the creative imagination, the unfolding of the myth of the life through its different phases. And I associate the moon, the sun with the myth of the life, and the moon with the poesis, the artistic practices that help translate between archetypal intelligence per se, because this is like a one mind, soul, body level within the earth. So the level of the archetypal intelligence that's coming through the planets, well, how do we embody and integrate that? We have to perform some kind of poetics of mind. And this is a lot to do with Hillman's psychology, soul making. And Hillman himself has the sun and the moon conjunct in his chart up at the 10th house. And so, again, and one limitation potentially of Jungian psychology is if you lack the cosmic framework, it can remain too subjective. Right? And this is Hillman's critique of Jung. Hillman tries to bring us to the objective image, to the truth of the imagination, to the truth of the gods that can't merely be, that are related to the human psyche, but also transcendent and bring in a transpersonal level of intelligence. And so Anthony's Astronoesis, and I wish I had more time to, then I feel that as I unfortunately hoped it would not be the case, but I have, could get into much more juicy practical detail about how this kind of cosmological framework helps you actually interpret, what the planets are, what the meaning of degree symbolism, the quadrants of the house, because it transforms one's whole relationship to astrology if you're looking at it against this background. Let's Aaron, one other example is that if you look at, I feel like there's someone like Emerson and Whitman, the transcendentalist stream of thought works in a certain way, which is transcendentalist. It assumes a knowledge of the spiritual self. It brackets, so to speak, the personal self. When Whitman writes the Song of Myself, he's not talking about, there's no psychology in that poem. It's the cosmic self. And so the transcendentalists are working from the oversoul, Emerson's oversoul, into the individual soul. And that's one tradition. It's related to what Paul Bunyan calls the short path. You have to bracket your person, and you just affirm and access the higher self and work from there. Whereas the depth psychological tradition, in a sense related to Romanticism, and related, and is certainly one example of that is Rilke, my poet. You're working from the interiority of the psyche and through the long path of soul making, trying to assimilate transpersonal intelligence. But there's a real difference there between a Whitman or an Emerson, and indeed one stream of American philosophy and poetry that works from the spirit into the soul, very different from a Rilke or a Wordsworth or a Proust, who's working from the psyche and trying to access the spiritual level of intelligence through that. And you actually see that in the charts. And one place that it shows up, it has to do with the conjunctions of Chaldeans and Transiturians. Like, we'll throw up Whitman in, but why don't we go through, put up Wordsworth's chart, which is actually the next one here. So Wordsworth, you remember what I was talking about, the moon. You see the fact that there's not only this psychological function, but the creative, rational function of the moon is also available to Wordsworth, indicated by the fact that it's conjunct Neptune at the very top of the chart, the midheaven, which of course means he's able to objectify that. Not only that, the Neptune, Pluto, and Uranus are in a grand trine, so you have the moon, which is obviously in a focal point of the chart, just in terms of the design, taking in all that transpersonal intelligence and functioning in a way that is at one and the same time psychological, but also genuinely creative, in terms of imaginative, creative literature, and really inaugurating a new phase in intellectual history. Wordsworth is, in some way, the poet of nature. And let's see, can we get, yeah. Okay, so this is a chart of, which is speaking about what I was just saying. We're familiar with this from the prior chart. I'm talking about the spiritual level of intelligence coming through the Uranus, Neptune, and Pluto. Psychological in sense is with the natal chart, but you have this mediation of the mythic and the poetic. the sun and the moon, which together are really the archetypal. And whether you're working from here and trying to bring that in, which is more the depth psychological way, or you're affirming and assuming this, like Emerson, you won't find much psychology in Emerson either. He's spiritual, and then the ego kind of reflects that spirituality. You know, Rilke is entirely different matter. And there's the mediation of that. You want to throw up the next chart? Okay. Yeah. So there's Emerson. In one place you see the inscription of this difference I'm talking about is that the Transcendentalist tradition usually is an Eastern chart. You have an emphasis on the ascendant and the midheaven and planets in this sector. You see it very strongly with Emerson with a Jupiter on the ascendant and Mercury on the midheaven, and then in the square. So there's a real emphasis on the ascendant and the midheaven. And that's because the quadrants of the chart also reflect that fourfold that I was talking about one, mind, soul, and body, so that the spiritual and sensible are figured in this portion of the chart, whereas the mythic and the poetic and the more properly psychological are usually here. And most of you probably have some knowledge of Jung's chart and Freud's chart, both of whom have Uranus Sun right on the descendant. And Jung has the Moon, Pluto, Neptune right down at the nadir. And if you look at Rilke's chart, you know, it's Sun smack on the nadir. And everything in here with the Sun, Mars, Moon conjunction in the 6th house. So you have the depth. You have, you know, the spiritual self, the depth psychological self, the cultural self involved in imaginative exchange, and then you have this self in the sensible world. And if you look as well at Whitman, let's throw up the next one. This is spectacular in terms of the song of myself coming from a transcendental place. Again, a marked Eastern emphasis, most of the planets on this part. Again, a midheaven, not so much ascendant, but a first house emphasis, the self and the cosmos. And Hillman, interestingly enough, who is a bridge between these traditions, right? Hillman's coming from depth psychology, but he's very American, iconoclastic, Emersonian. He's trying to break away from the subjectivism of depth psychology. He has the Pluto right on the ascendant. Uranus, Mercury, Sun, Moon up in the 10th house. So he's also in that, very much in that department. So again, like these perspectives that I'm sharing with you come out of the background of that I tried to lay out. And I'm sorry we didn't have more time to look at the juicy details, but I'm glad we went through some of the cosmology and epistemology, because it does give an entirely different sense of what we're doing when we're interpreting these particulars, the soul and the roots and so forth, a different kind of cosmic philosophical background. So I've taken almost all the time, which is too bad, but are there questions? I know I've thrown a tremendous amount at you, some of which was very dense, and you've been very patient. So if there are any questions, I'd love to try and answer them. Yeah.
You mentioned attaining kind of heliocentric consciousness. Do you work with heliocentric charts at all?
No, Anthony was dedicated to, are you asking about Anthony?
Yeah.
Yeah, he was dedicated to the regular
Geocentric.
because he says that's where we are, and we attain with the sunlight body comes through the creative imagination, but we're not standing on the sun. So he was very dedicated to the Ptolemaic vision and felt that was the one, and always worked with that.
So working more with the world transits from a whole.
World transits that come through the personal transits. And the world transits, yes, that's the rational. That's the world mind, entering our psychic stream. And how do we assimilate that? Well, the personal transits. Yeah. Yes.
There's a question from us, student Teresita online, so you might be able to see her here. Go ahead, Teresita.
Thanks, Matt. Can you hear me?
Yeah, let me turn you up. 1 second.
All right, better?
Yep.
So thank you. I wanted to start with the definition of philosophy that you shared at the beginning, or Anthony's definition that the goal is to become a good citizen. And I'm wondering if we can infer that this progression towards a larger consciousness is necessarily positive, in that it might allow humanity to recognize our place in the whole and learn in turn how to be those good citizens collectively?
Very much so, yes. In fact, and I think social cohesion and respect for the other is really premised on respect for the self. And philosophy is a search for self-knowledge. And if one knows oneself, there's no reason to be disrespectful for the other, because there's a knowledge that at root you are actually the same. You are actually both souls, and you are actually connected. And there is no, see, can we go back to the first step for a minute? One very crucial thing is that this is the place of the subject versus object, what we call the ego. But the fact that Anthony, what he emphasizes, is that the authentic I comes actually from the soul in the nukes. It's actually the oversoul. And that any ego, that ego in the embodied self is, when it is an authentic I, it is so, because it's reflecting a higher principle in which connects us all. Because at higher or deeper levels of ourselves, we really aren't, we're many souls, but we're one soul. We're not divided. We're part of that undivided phase of soul. And so, this mystery of the ego, what is the self? Well, the authenticity of our being is from the oversoul. And the more that we develop, the more that we can realize that our egoic identity is only genuine insofar as it is serving this larger identity. And actually, when you put up the now chart, this is something I also wanted to talk about in greater depth than I was able to today. But right now, what we have is a Saturn-Venus-Pluto conjunction in the sky as I'm giving this talk. And that's interesting because the basis of the embodied soul, in a way, is both Saturn and Pluto. Because what I was just talking about is Pluto is the vehicle of the higher will, the spiritual will. And it's a transiting or rational function of Pluto. There's always, in an almost Buddhist sense, deconstruction of whatever ego constellation has been fixed for the moment. It's transformation. It never stays the same. It's what Emerson calls the perpetual expansion of the self. And the Saturn does consolidate fixed structures which we need to maintain an identity, but it's only a relative. It's only a relative self. So there's a dynamic between Pluto and Saturn, and if you remember that Whitman had that Saturn-Pluto conjunction, you think, oh, Saturn-Pluto conjunction, contraction, and Melville and agony and so forth. Well, for Whitman, it didn't manifest that way at all. It's Pluto being the higher will. It allowed him to surrender the little ego and live out of the self with an S in a way that worked for him. If you didn't have a Pluto-Saturn conjunction in Pisces in the 12th house, which is a real surrendering of that ego, it might not work so well for you. But there's this dynamic of the, that yes, the Saturn gives us knowledge of our relative self, but the real foundation of our authentic selfhood, our I am, is always involved with the spiritual intelligence, which isn't the separative ego, which isn't the soul divided among bodies. But yeah, so this is very interesting. The higher will, the lower will, and the soul, the Venus, sandwich there. And actually, let's put up the painting. So this is an image of Pluto, Saturn, Venus. If you want to stay, I can tell you why. But I'd like to answer if there's any more. Anybody know this painting? Or yeah, yes, it's Botticelli's idealized portrait of a lady, and I will say a bit about it, but I would like to see if there are any other questions before I maybe close with this. Yes.
In fact, that painting was just in San Francisco.
Yes, well, that's where that's part of what I.
So for Plotinus in astrology,
Yeah.
he seems to have there's something about matter being non-existent or kind of a nothing, and I wondered to what degree the planets are considered as matter, or like how do we find them if they're not material? Like, is Astronoesis considered planets to be like only psychic markers? Or?
No, they're gods. They're spiritual intelligences. Yeah, they're not. I mean, in Plotinus is actually two orders of matter. And the first matter is which allows the universe to come into being at all. It's like the Tzimtzum in Kabbalism. There's got to be a space in which the universe can manifest. That's like a primary cosmic matter. But then at this level, matter is nullity. It's negation. It's the absence of the good. And it's that which means that we are living in fallen consciousnesses to the extent that we're experiencing the world as other than, and other people as other than ourselves. Now, and that's a problem. At the same time, it's the condition of evolution, because we only evolve in the freedom of our will to choose between good and evil, whether we're serving Saint Michael and the spiritual intelligence that we are, or if we're serving the dragon, which is a fragmented state in which all the soul powers, as Anthony said, it's only in the embodied ego that the soul powers are fragmented. At the level of the sun, they're all in harmony. It's a unity. And so that, of course, is also central to the philosophic quest, and the psychological process of soulmaking is working through the complexes so that the planetary functions actually coordinate and harmonize and reflect the one, rather than what we see dramatized in our political life, all the forces tearing at each other in a fragmentary way, which is, it's a struggle between good and evil. When you have fragmentation and division, you're in which is very different from diversity, because true diversity is premised upon true unity. The soul is one and many. And so it's soul knowledge that actually allows diversity, difference, without that being fragmenting and divisive. And that's another answer, to the question that soul knowledge is really the premise of social cohesion and of good society, which is what Anthony said. It's wisdom and it's beauty, which is beauty. The traditional definition is the cooperation of many parts in a unified whole, which also has to do with this picture. But any other questions? Yes.
It's just as if you use the terms oversoul and spirit to describe the same thing. Is that right?
Pretty much. Yeah. I mean, yeah, we could get into some, but yeah. Pretty much they're using them very similarly. Yeah. Any other pressing questions? Would you like to hear a little bit about her? Okay. So this is Botticelli's idealized portrait of a woman, or Simonetta Vespucci, who was this person, as nymph. And a way of talking about this, I'm going to read the poem I wrote in response to this painting. And then I can try and tell you why I think it's related to Saturn, Venus, Pluto. So this is idealized portrait of a lady, Simonetta Vespucci, as nymph. I see, master, what drew you to her, why you devoted endless attention to this noble face and figure, the high, clear forehead, aquiline nose and mouth, eyes looking out as if looking into an unseen world more real than our own. Windows, truly. Who is she? This nymph with pearls of dew strung above cascading wavelets of red hair, her slender neck adorned by antique cameo and bosom lifted lightly by the invisible thought of the heart. Who is she? Image of a new ideal, Renaissance lady of the unicorn? No magic creature places its forefeet gently in her lap. No lamb-like face appears in the mirror she does not hold. Even so, look, upon the crown of her head, no jeweled horn, but a ruby blossoming rose-like in golden calyx, and a snowy spray of egret or heron feather, whiter even than her translucent skin. A braided tassel, much like the lady's, all signifying soul conscious of itself, embodied form wed to spirit, true beauty, human and divine. So do people know the Lady and the Unicorn tapestries? Because much of my work, I've worked a lot with those tapestries, so of course, I forgot to warn you, there's a reference to them in here. I read them as sequences of the soul's path, child soul, youth soul, liminal soul, etc., taking a cue from an anthroposophist who reads them in that way. And the soul's path is that long path, the depth psychological path. It's not the transcendentalist short path. And the culmination of it, ideally, is self-knowledge, which is the psyche, the embodied self, who is cognizant of its relationship to spirit, to the oversoul, aware at one and the same time that the embodied soul is the embodiment of the higher I am, and at the same time is never a complete version of it. And that's where you get Saturn and Pluto. Saturn having to do, again back to Anthony's rational Gnostic level of soul function. It's real self-knowledge. It's self-consciousness, knowledge of the self as a mortal, and also having an immortal dimension, but never being able to identify the ego with that higher self. And that's what's symbolized by the accent on the crown chakra, which you see in the lady and the unicorn through this tapestry sequence. She actually grows a horn in the course of those 6 tapestries. She begins with nothing, and then there's a little sprout, and it gets thicker, and by the time you get to the last sequence, you actually have a jeweled horn. And that is what is also signified here, which of course Saturn would be associated with the crown chakra. It's authentic soul consciousness, which Rudolf Steiner would say perhaps would be the consciousness soul, the embodied ego aligned with a higher will, which would be the Pluto aspect, that you as a vessel are dedicated to doing God's will, not your own. And in that is true beauty, which is where the Venus comes in. In that is embodied form. We're not talking about attaining nirvana some other where. We're talking about the embodiment of the logos, embodied form wed to spirit. And that's true beauty, both human and divine. So that's Botticelli. So any other thoughts, questions? I mean, I could gladly stay here all night, but and as usual, I got the best part of the talk in about the last 5 minutes. And it always happens to me. I don't know why, but all this stuff that you have to go through, and then what I really want to talk about comes in the last 10, 15 minutes. I don't know what that dynamic is, and maybe I'll get a hold of it some. But
it was wonderful. Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you, Daniel.
Thank you very much for your patient attention, and I hope it was worthwhile.